Alright, this presentation is going to talk about security issues, particularly covering the readings in the textbook, chapter 13 and 14. Starting off, the first one is this chapter by Sheehan on the nature of war, and it's worth pointing out it's chapter 13 in the Baylis et al. Text, or Baylis, Smith, and Owens. When, we have to keep in mind, it's written by Michael Sheehan, and so it would be Sheehan 2011 as a citation. The reference would be, as you see here, and I tried to slavishly follow the APA style on this. However, I couldn't do it. I couldn't put a period after a parentheses. There's supposed to be a period after the 2011. Technically, you're supposed to have, in their thing, they have initials for the author's first name, which to my mind is just absurd. Why would we not have the guy's first name? It's M. Sheehan. There could be more. It's better to have the first name, if you ask me. It's worth the time, to throw out. So I know it's Mike. And I can't not put quotation marks around the title. It's just me. But point is, this is more or less what you're supposed to do for a citation here. And you see, it's a chapter in a volume, and it's Sheehan so and so in Baylis, blah blah blah. Okay. Also, I think one of the interesting things, and something I'm going to talk mainly about, is the Human Security Report. And so I have here the reference for the Human Security Report, which I got online. I saw it was mentioned, the 2005 report is mentioned in the text, and I went and got the newer one, and there's a link to it in the lecture section. And here's how you would reference that. I'm pretty sure a lot of folks will just put Human Security Report 2012. That's not, that's okay. I like to, since there's clearly an organization that published it, I put the organization as the author, date, who did it, and you treat it just like a book, but it's retrieved online at blah 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 blah. That's good. That's how you do a reference, right? You never ever just put the URL for something in as a reference. Okay, let's talk about this chapter here. It's very abstract. Both these chapters are very abstract in some way. He's talking about how war has changed, and he's talking about the contested definitions, and you hear this a lot, contested. In fact, political science and international relations is what is known as a contested discipline, meaning that different people have different ideas about definitions and fundamental viewpoints, and so it's contested. So war, the very concept of war, is contested, meaning that we have different ideas about it. You have the Clausewitzian idea, which sees war, and this is pure Clausewitz, an act of force to compel our opponents to fulfill our will. Right? And which is basically making war out to be a very purposive and coercive endeavor. Right? It's a very and that definition, by the way, can encompass a lot of things you might not think of war. I mean, sure, that sounds like what a war is, but it, an act of force, well, it doesn't have to be an all-out war, right? It could be a threat. It could be, a demonstration. It could be a lot of things that aren't necessarily what we would think of as a war, right? Lots of uses of force. Hedley Bull says it's organized violence carried on by political units against each other, which is a very expansive definition of war. That, well, any organized violence, again, it's a very expansive. But here the emphasis is not on the purpose, but rather the form, right? And so, in some ways, that's less strict in that it's not assuming that war is purposive. It's saying, no, anytime you have organized violence carried on by political units against each other, that's a war. Of course, now, then we have the Singer and Small thing, and basically those guys they wrote the data. So this is the COW, right? Singer and Small data set. That's Correlates of War Project. And 1,000 battle deaths per year, right? If you got violence between two states and there's 1,000 battle deaths per year, that's a war. what do we do with these things? And I think the point that you want to take out of it is, in general, what do we mean by war? And, if these are the definitions of war, what do we mean by a war on terror or a war on drugs? Right? Isn't there's some other concept attached to war, or some other meaning attached to the symbol, which is the word war, that isn't even touched by these things, right? Maybe by the Clausewitzian idea that it's an active force to compel opponents to fulfill our will. Although, what are we asking terrorists to do? Right? It's kind of like in Independence Day. What do you want us to do? We want you to die. Right? And they shoot the guy. But that's the thing. Is that are we trying to get people to do our will? You could argue, well, we're trying to get you to not do something, that there's deterrence. But or are we just out to destroy? These are the questions you have to ask, and these are the questions. In academia we ask these things. So, because it's a contested definition, we're not going to end up anywhere. But what might be frustrating you, but you just have to be ready to talk about these things and think about these things, and you should start thinking to yourself, what do I mean by war, and what do other people mean, and really keep in mind it's a loaded term. Now, the chapter makes one comment. It just blows through this idea that, well, war is less common, and it makes a reference in like the first couple paragraphs of the chapter, and then it moves on. Well, let's slow down a minute. Right? I mean, I've really been big. I've been hitting you with all these ideas and theories. How about we just take a look at the world for a second? You might not consider this to be the world. You might say, this is lass with grass. Here are descriptive statistics. And by the way, when we talk about statistics, descriptive statistics are not trying to show a relationship. They're just trying to show you what happened. And it's generally one variable. Right, you're looking at one variable across cases. In this case, I got three figures that I brought from the Human Security Report. This first one is the trend in state-based conflicts, and it shows the number of state-based armed conflicts going on. Right, so that's not necessarily war. That's bigger than, well, the Singer and Small definition of war. Here we have another thing, right? It's a state-based conflict. We can't use war, right? But when states are conflicting with one another. For 1946 to 2009, so we're looking at one variable, the number of these things in each observation each year. And so this is just saying what happened. And you can see here that, for 1946, the number of state-based conflicts, stayed steady until the 60s, and then it increases a lot. And I'll tell you, these are your wars of liberation. This is kind of, I would argue, although maybe we should look at it more, you're largely seeing these post-colonial, right? This is the era of decolonization and a lot of conflict around the world. And then it culminates, these things kind of peak 1991 there, and one-ish, two-ish. And then they drop precipitously. There's this huge drop at the end of the Cold War. There's this massive drop, which of course makes you wonder, what the hell? You just said it was about colonialization. Why would it stop at the end of the Cold War? So that's why I say, don't take everything I say. It's an idea. When I put an asterisk by it to say, well, here's a thought. It's open to interpretation. But we have this huge drop off, right, of conflict at the end of that, and you could argue that you could argue realist style that this is a move from a bipolar world where the sides are constrained to a unipolar world where the U.S. is policing things, or you could argue that with the end of the Cold War, the economic rationales overrode whatever. And I drifted off into talking about explanations when I was saying, hey, let's just look at the data. The data shows a big drop, but then it kind of came back, right? And so it's not, the world is more peaceful than it used to be in terms of these state-based conflicts, although it was more peaceful in the late 40s, right? So What do we think about that? I don't know, but this is what's going on. And I do want to push back. There's this idea that, oh, since 2001, the world has been just so much, we live in a much more dangerous world. Well, I mean, it's we've lived in less dangerous worlds, but in a lot of ways, we're coming off of a peak of state-based conflicts. Now, let's look at some other measures of conflict, too. Here we have the trends in war, right? And this is actually figure 5.3. We're going to get 5.2 in a second. But and this is big war, right? What they call high-intensity conflicts. And these are conflicts that go with that 1,000 battle deaths a year. And it's kind of grouped into decades. And you see that, yeah, in fact, when we get down to big wars, they have subsided to the lowest level since the 50s, right? That we had the peak in the 80s, still pretty high in the 90s, but now we're at a low period where we only really had 6 of these things going on, per year. So, which is half of what it was in the 80s. So we have this idea that the big wars, even though there's still a few out there, they haven't completely gone away. They're a lot less. They've subsided. Here's the real interesting thing, the lethality of the world, right? Really, really dropped in terms of battle deaths, the number of people who actually die. And I think the thing you have to keep in mind is that the world population is like doubling or more than that in these decades, right? So these are absolute numbers, right? Hundreds of thousands of people who are killed, and really the number, that's if you look at a rate, that's the numerator. The denominator is the population of the world, and that keeps expanding. So when you look at the world, the Korean War was, wow, we were killing some people. We want to attack Americans with human waves. Well, there's going to be people, there are going to be bodies on the ground. But we move into the 70s with Vietnam, and we move into, and of course Vietnam, it doesn't peak in terms per year, but it's longer. So like you add up everyone, and there's a lot of dead people there. And then you have the Iran-Iraq War in the 80s. But in general, the lethality, the number is really dropped down. Again, we've been this low in the late 50s, but by and large, we see a lot less people being killed in state-based conflicts. So again, the world, I would have told you back when, a couple decades ago, back when I was maybe a graduate student, the empirical wisdom, right? When you looked at these things, the story was, hey, the number of wars have been decreasing, right, over time, and especially when you looked, this is just post-World War II. When you look back to the 19th century, there were a lot more wars going on. And the story over hundreds of years said the number of wars was decreasing, but the number of deaths was constantly increasing, right? And that war was getting more lethal, especially non-combatant deaths, right? Well, here we see that the deaths are dropping off, right? And they include all, I believe in the Human Security Report, they don't have the non-combatant combatant distinction. Although you might want to check that. Point though is the world really that unsafe? And we have this narrative going on that it's this dangerous world. I got to tell you, there's hard to empirically verify that, and in fact, you can more easily argue the other direction, and that's what these, certainly these human security guys will tell that story, and so I think that's something that you have to keep in mind, and that's empirical. It's just there, right? And that's a fact that we have to deal with, and we have to start asking why. This is one of these questions: why do we have this popular notion that things are more dangerous? And is that the result of culture? Is that the result of people being stupid? Is that the result of interests that are better served by that? You can have a very cynical military-industrial complex view of it. I don't go for those things, but you got to entertain them, and you got to say, why do we have this narrative going on that the world is so much more dangerous? And it might be that it is less, less certain, and it might be that people feel more threatened, and that might be legitimate, right? But empirically, we have this little factoid here that kind of sits and goes, well, what's going on? Creates a puzzle, and that's the kind of thing we like to solve. Okay, now, another thing that the chapter talked about is the concept of new wars. Notice that Mary Kaldor comes up with this in 1999, and which is perhaps, we say that's a pre-9/11 view, and sometimes that's good, because to have those, the world did not change on September 11th. The world was pretty much the same way that it was the day before, but something happened, right? And our attitudes and perceptions of the world might have changed, but this is a very positivist view I'm expressing, but when we study this, we sometimes want to say, hey, look, what people were saying in 1999, that's interesting because they weren't influenced by this big event. And what they were saying, they might not be forecasting the terrorist threat as much, but maybe we should go back to that and look at that and say, well, here ex ante, previous to what were people thinking? And Kaldor was saying, hey, look, we're going to get a new wave of wars, and they're not state on state as much. They're far more internally focused, but she argues that the driving force here are the contradictory processes of globalization. Now, your textbook's really big on globalization, and in that it's one of the things that doesn't really fit as an intro course. We use this textbook, but it does overemphasize globalization, I think, and so they picked up on this theme. But in this case, I think it's interesting the argument is made that, look, we have these contradictory processes going on in the world. We have integration of nations and economies. At the same time, we have fragmentation. We have, the breaking up into ethnic groups, and, we have autonomy going on in areas, demands for autonomy. And so, you've got this push to integrate your society, and then you have pulls to fragment, right? That people are able to connect with other people and express their ethno-nationalist points of view or aspirations for independence. So we have that. We have this push. There's a globalization and a localization process. That there's a push for global influences. There's a lot more of these things out there. There's a lot more global processes, multinational corporations, international governmental organizations. At the same time, there is greater localization as we've got more democracy going on, and we have, and in fact, I would argue when you talk about free markets, there's a lot more local attention that needs to be paid to local economies, and in fact, that's what entrepreneurs do. I like to say the essence of it is that you have to think local and buy global, right? Find out what the local demand is, what people really want, and then find a global supplier of that stuff. But that tension is there. Also, the idea of homogenization versus diversification. We are this push for everything to be the same. We get the same movies, the same news. You're getting, if you're global, you get CNN, you get BBC, and you get Al Jazeera, right? I mean, these are the big three news organizations out there. And now in the United States, we have our own. You wouldn't necessarily come up with that list, but if you go outside the United States, these are the big three. and there's this homogenization to it. I mean, Al Jazeera, I made you look at the Al Jazeera stuff this week because I thought it was a good report on China, but also I think it's very interesting. Here's Al Jazeera. If you haven't seen Al Jazeera, this is what it is. It's got a British accent, and it looks very much like a BBC or a CNN thing. At the same time, we have the diversification. People are again expressing their desires, the greater freedom. They want to be, practice their religion. They want to speak their language, and so there's this big push to recognize and protect these individual and smaller group interests. And so, you have this challenge, and so Kaldor is arguing that these contradictions are what's going to drive conflict. And here you have a thesis that you could put right up there with Clash of Civilizations as an alternative, as a kind of a different take on it, and it's certainly pushing back against Francis Fukuyama. But really, we want to get past that stuff into deeper research. So this is Kaldor's view that we're going to have these new types of wars. They're going to be civil conflicts driven a lot. We're going to have a lot more failed state concerns. And the focus is going to be on identity, that how people identify themselves. And a big part of identity is it's not just how you think about yourself, it's about how other people treat you, right? And so your identity needs to be recognized by other people. They have to let you wear a headscarf if you want to frickin' wear a headscarf. They have to speak your language or not. If you have a dialect that you're trying to protect in France, this is a big issue. Actually, you go to France and you see all these issues really playing out. And this is the thing: is how other people treat me. Do you recognize my rights? Do you give me my rights materially, and do you socially recognize them? And that's a big part of this. So, this focus on identity, she argues, is going to be a characteristic of the new wars. And I don't even without, you can throw 9/11 in there. It's civil conflict. I mean, it could be just part of all that. So this is Kaldor's view. Interesting one. Okay, moving on to the Baylis chapter. This is Baylis, one of the editors, actually wrote this chapter, and talking about international global security. Yeah, this chapter, both these chapters are abstract and thinking conceptually. I think this is really more abstract because he problematizes the concept of security. What the hell does that mean? When you problematize an idea, it's you take the idea and you raise, you identify problems with it. You start contesting it. You start picking it apart. They often talk about unpacking. If you pull security out into different things. Like I could tell you that, look, security, there's material security, there's the actual threat to you, in the sense that frickin' insurance companies do actuarial tables and tell you, here's your chance of getting killed by a terrorist versus being struck by lightning, right? And so that's the actual material thing. But then I could say there's also a ideational or a psychological security, right? Of how threatened do you feel, right? Yes, you're more likely to get killed by lightning than by terrorism, but you might be far more worried about terrorism than the other. And therefore, we can unpack the concept of security into two things: an ideational or psychological versus a material one. And in bringing this up, I am problematizing the concept. And this is the kind of thing that your critical theory guys do, and a lot. And so just throwing that out there, the idea of problematizing this concept. And that's basically what Baylis is doing. And through the process, he's going to give you kind of a rehash of the realism, liberalism. Actually, it's a rehash of everything here. But he gives you a rehash of the realism, liberalism, so, that's good. Very big emphasis on relative gains, and the idea is that the emphasis here in relative gains is that generally cooperation is a situation in which both sides gain, and the kind of the liberal view of things is it doesn't matter how much one side gains or the other. As long as we cooperate, we both are better off than we would be if we didn't cooperate. And if you make more than I do out of the deal, what do I care? Right? That's a very economic theory concept, right? If you make $1,000 on a deal and I make 100, you know, so what? The question, the only relevant question is, am I better off with $100 or with nothing? Right? And, the option was never there for me to make 1,000. It was, if I join in this, my take is 100. And so why should I care what you make? The realists say, well, when states are doing this thing, they're worried about relative gains. And if I make 100 and you make 1,000, or if I make 100 million and you make 1 billion, in terms of, the gain you get from whatever it is we decide to do, maybe trading with one another, right? That billion, you could buy an aircraft carrier, right? You can buy an aircraft carrier, and I can buy a frigate. What, for $100 million, what can I get? What can you get in the military? Actually, you can't buy an aircraft carrier for $1 billion. Let's just work with me. You can get more weapons with $1 billion than you can get with $100 million, 10 times. So, oops, that's a problem, right? Now we have a security problem out of that. That's the relative gains thing. Realists emphasize it, and liberals and economists, the economic view on that is that's crap. But that is one thing that is brought up in this chapter that I don't know has been covered in the other ones. Moving on. Interesting, Baylis spends as much time on, I counted the pages as 4 pages on the general, straight, what he considers the mainstream approach, and then equal time for alternative approaches. I don't know what I think about that, but he talks about constructivism. Really, in some ways, the readings we've had on the security agenda, the security, the Farrell reading, and talking about that as a research program, the readings we had a couple weeks ago probably did a much better job on this. And I think the key thing, when you look at this, we do have the concept of security communities, which is actually kind of a pre-constructivist idea. Comes from the international society literature, but it's that idea of it's called a security community. The idea is that a group of nations will begin to feel that they have a community going on because they are allied. And the idea is, hey, one of the concept was developed as a general rule, but out of the specific example of NATO, that once the NATO nations start cooperating over a long period of time, they start to identify each other as on the same side. We're together. We're on the same, and we're fighting the big bad bear. There's a bear in the woods, and we're in this together. And so they start developing contacts, and socially, although they didn't get as straight into the idea of identities in the international society thing, that's the idea, is that we start identifying them as friendly others, right? And they may be others, the other members of NATO may be others, but they're friendly others. And as we start developing this idea, and the idea of fighting them is just, ridiculous. And it moves away. The idea of them as an enemy and us being threatened by them diminishes in ways that realism say can't happen, right? We should be worried about the Germans having cool weapons and having been armed, except that they were our allies, and once there's no threat, they should be threatening to us, right? That would be the realist point of view. Constructivism says, we have these security communities, and now we just view the Germans and the French and the Italians and all these guys as we've worked in NATO, we've worked together, right? And so our sense of community will move forward, and we will do things together. Maybe based on this identity. We're just going to treat each other because we have these different meanings. We see each other as allies, as friends, as on the same side. The key thing that the discussion of material versus ideational, I think it's very important to remember power politics is an idea, and from the constructivist point of view, it's an idea. It's a concept, right? But it's real. It's important. The key thing with constructivism is just because it's a social fact, because it's constructed, doesn't mean it's not real, right? Dollars are constructed completely, right? A dollar bill is inherently meaningless, right? It's worth nothing. It's a piece of paper, right? But in some cases there is no such thing as it's a number in a bank account. But the fact that everyone agrees that it's something and they're willing to trade you goods and services for it makes it a very real thing. So again, power politics, even if it's just an idea, it counts. And so, power counts. And the key thing is, though, that there are other ideas. There are other concepts out there. There are other ideational factors. And that everything is not material. And the material still matters. But there are other things involved as well. And that's always an important point. Never to throw out the material baby with the bathwater here. A little bit, I think Baylis goes a little far in saying, oh, well, if we change our ideas, we can be more secure. Remember, ideas constrain us as much as they open up the opportunity for change. And that was something that Farrell talked about, or Ted Hoff talked about in the promise of constructivism. He said, people are overemphasizing. Yes, change can occur, but also constructivism shows you why it doesn't, right? That these ideas provide structure to the world, and then they provide stability. And so ideas can endure for a freaking long time. And, once the idea gets established, it may just be an idea, but, so you can talk about doing away with money, but I'd like to see you live without it, and you're probably not going to, right? And therefore, you can't, I think that Baylis is over, you can't just change the way you think and become more secure, but you do have to recognize that your feelings of security or insecurity are a function of the way you think. See, that's a slightly different view, and it's a lot less hold hands, sing kumbaya, and everything will be fine, right? That's not the message of constructivism as far as, Hoff talked about that, and I would argue that as well. The key thing, by the way, there's this concept of ontological security out there as well, and it isn't hit and discussed here. Ontological security. Ontology is what you think is in the world, or a statement of ontology is a statement. There are radical terrorists that want to destroy the United States. That is an ontological statement, right? It may or may not be true, right? And we can verify whether it's true or not. But it's a statement about the world, right? And when you ontological security refers to the certainty that people have, the confidence that people have in their ontological view of the world, right? So when you state, the Soviet Union is an evil empire, right? When you go back to the Cold War and you have this view that the Soviet Union is bent on, you have this very negative view of communism, right? And you have this ontological view that the Soviets are expansionist and a threat, right? When they do something like invade Afghanistan or shoot down Korean Airlines aircraft as they did, while that's threatening, it also helps your security, right? It makes you feel better. It's like, yeah, see, we told you. I knew it. I knew they were bad. It confirms your view of the world. And so understanding who's good, who's bad, your concept, and generally you fit in that it has to do with your identity. We're the good guys. They're the bad guys. Why are we the good guys? Because they're the bad guys and we're against them. This is ontological security, right? Being aware. And you can be more secure even if you're actually threatened, right? If you get this confirmation of your view of the world, and it relates to how people They see the world, they understand the threats, and as long as they understand them, they can deal with them. It's uncertainty that kind of throws them for a loop, right? And that's why when the Soviet, suddenly, Gorbachev starts making nice, it freaked a lot of people out, because even though our physical security, our material security was about to shoot through the roof, right? In a couple of years, the Navy is going to go in and there'll be no threat combatants at sea. And they're like, really? What? No. At the same time, ontological security is under. We're just waiting for those commies to come out of the woodwork. It must be a trap. And you have this whole, who's the enemy? Who's the good guy? You have this big challenge to your view of the world. And so ontological security is something that is also a big part of constructivism. Critical theory, all right, I've talked a lot on this slide. There's a lot of discussion of critical theory, feminism, post-structuralism. All of these things, I think there's a good discussion of what's the difference between more positivist, they call it puzzle-solving theories by Cox, versus critical theory. In the critical theory, they're trying to examine how existing relationships and institutions emerge so they can be changed. And you have this, very much this idea in critical theory that ideas are important. They're much like constructivists. They see ideas as being important. But there's a certain activism about the critical theorists where they believe that studying the ideas makes a difference, and that they can change the world with their silly love songs, if you will. Don't ever write that down. But that actually going out and thinking about these things, encouraging people to have new thoughts, creating a new discourse, right? Hey, the discourse is constrained by the way people think about things, by the language that is used, and if we start talking about it in different terms, and we start bringing in a different way of discussing things, a different way of viewing the world and viewing the issues involved, then we will change the world, right? Because the world, the key thing in critical theory is, and is very much related to postmodernism, the idea that how we perceive the world is the way the world is. And so if you change your perception of the world, that's as good as changing the world. And this is the, some people call this the concept of ideas all the way down, that the world is all about ideas, and the material doesn't matter because the material is only understood through ideas and only perceived through them and communicated through them. So it's ideas all the way down, which is actually what constructivism does not accept, right? That's why I spent so much time saying, hey, power and material things are still there. The critical theory and postmodernism moves more in that direction of ideas all the way down. Sometimes you've heard about postmodernism. They say there's no there, meaning there's no objective world. It's all about our perceptions. So that's what we're getting at there. I don't know how much we want to do with that, but if you're into that sort of thing, this book has a lot on the alternative approaches. And they're fine. I just want to put them in perspective that, hey, they are. And you can also see, though, why constructivism is so popular, because it does go halfway there. And so while the purists, the critical theory purists, don't like it, they generally get on well. They can talk to constructivists. They recognize what they're doing, and it's an improvement on what everyone else is doing. So, there's you can see that that's why constructivism is perhaps so popular, is that it bridges the gap a little bit. So, okay, that's those two chapters.